If you are discouraged in life, please find someone to encourage you, to give you hope, to help you keep going again. Because someone once said, and I thought this was great, encouragers are God's jumper cables to the church. Today we're going to see how different the Apostle Paul's life would have been, or John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, how his life would have been different without a man, Barnabas, who encouraged them both. Join us today as we continue in the book of Acts. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Acts in 10-ish series. Glad you're joining us. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about discouragement and encouragement. And we've been talking about a man by the name of Barnabas, who was well known in the early church as someone who encouraged others. He was considered an encourager. Now, we ended last week with him selling some property. And just by doing that and giving the money to the apostles was very, very encouraging to them. It made them feel like they were on the right track. So we talked last week about how giving money is a way to encourage people. But I want to go through a couple other verses today and see how Barnabas encourages people like the Apostle Paul. And then next week we'll pick it back up in Acts chapter 5. But let's look at Acts chapter 9, because we want to see how the Apostle Paul was encouraged by Barnabas. Paul was originally, his name was Saul. Saul was a very devout Jewish Pharisee. He hated the early Christians. It was this group called the Way. The idea of Jesus or the Messiah was literally destroying everything that Saul believed. And because Saul was brilliant and he was religious and he was a Pharisee and all of those kind of things. And then the Jesus followers come on the scene saying, no, we found the Messiah. And Paul wanted nothing to do with that. At the time it was Saul. Saul wanted nothing to do with it. When Stephen, one of the followers of Jesus, was arrested and started preaching, look at what Acts 7:57 says. But they raised a great shout, put their hands over their ears, and rushed together upon him. They're going to kill Stephen. Then they dragged him out of the city, began to stone him, and the witnesses placed their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. This would be who we're talking about today. Saul wanted, he was like perfectly happy with them just, killing Christians. Acts 8:1 says this, and Saul was there, giving approval to his death. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. Saul was like a religious terrorist. Like, you don't believe my way, I'm going to kill you. That was Saul's deal. We see a lot of that going on right now in the Middle East. Kind of like renounce your faith in Jesus, or we're going to kill you or behead you or crucify you or whatever they're doing. And Saul would have not only been a part of that group, but he kind of was the leader, it seemed like. So on his way to terrorize people, this is what happens in Acts 9. Meanwhile, Saul was breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. He's out rounding up all the Christians to throw them in prison. As he neared Damascus, verse 3, on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Like, this is Jesus. He's having an encounter with Jesus. And suddenly, this religious terrorist, I would say this is like a moment, a born-again moment for Saul. There's so many stories like Saul's story. Here's a book here called Women Who Risk, and it's by Tom and Joanne Doyle. If you want a really good read about what's going on in the Middle East and how people are doing what happened with Saul, like Saul has this encounter with Jesus, a risen Jesus. And so many people in the Middle East that are Muslims are having the exact same encounter with him. And so that's what happens to Paul. And so Paul, being type A, I'm all in for my Jewish faith, now changed jerseys. And now he's all in for Jesus. And the same passion that he had for persecuting the church, now he has that same passion for promoting the good news about Jesus. But he had a problem, and it was this. Nobody really believed his conversion. Everyone thought that it was just a ploy, like that he's pretending to be a Christian so that, he'll infiltrate the church and then he'll kill them all. Like, in their mind, this is what's going on. Now, I'll tell you my little story about this. Super embarrassed to even tell you this. Can't believe I'm even telling you this. But many, many years ago, we went to church and they were showing baptisms, and they had put a man on the screen who was clearly a convert from Islam. And my first thought was not, oh, that's so awesome. My first thought was, I hope this guy isn't faking his belief in Jesus to infiltrate our church and destroy it. Like, that was my first thought, which is kind of sad. But then it dawned on me that the early disciples thought the same thing about Saul, which made me feel much better about my own cynicism. But they probably thought, oh, really? Like, he became a follower of Jesus. Like, yesterday he wanted to kill us. Today he wants to join us. Like, they were kind of confused and actually kind of afraid. Look at Acts 9, verse 26. When he came to Jerusalem, so this is Saul. When Saul comes to Jerusalem, he tries to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas, here's where we see our encourager Barnabas. But Barnabas took Saul, brought him to the apostles, and he told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. William Arthur Ward wrote this: "Flatter me, and I may not believe you. Criticize me, and I may not like you. Ignore me, and I may not forgive you. But encourage me, and I will not forget you." I bet Paul never forgot Barnabas for taking a stand, who put his prejudice aside, his fear aside, and believed Saul, who eventually his name was changed to Paul, believed Paul now when nobody else did. And when you can do that for someone, nothing can be more encouraging. It makes me think about Mary Kay Ash. Mary Kay Cosmetics. She wasn't in the cosmetic business, but originally she was in the people business. She was a committed Christian who generously gave to her First Baptist Dallas church. But she wrote this. She said, "Pretend that every single person you meet has a sign around his or her neck that says, 'Make me feel important.' Not only will you succeed in sales, but you will succeed in life." That's what encouragers do. They see someone and they want to say something that will make that person feel important, feel worthy, feel like, someone loves them and cares for them. Encouragers say things like this, which I think Barnabas probably said to Saul. I know you may be struggling with trials, but don't give up. Please don't give up. I know you may feel isolated, but oh my gosh, I'm so thankful for you. You may feel weak, but here's the deal. I want you to know I'm praying for you. I know a woman probably about, 15, 20 years ago. She was a mom at one of the schools that my kids were going to. And every time I walked by her, she said something nice, something encouraging. "Oh, I like your shirt. Oh, you look nice today. Oh, today this." And then the next person that walked by, she'd say something nice to them. Like, I have never seen such an encourager in all my life. She had nothing bad to say. Everything was encouraging, lifting someone up. Well, fast forward 20 years later to about 2 months ago, I happened to see her in Hobby Lobby. Just randomly, she was up, at a different stand, but I heard her talking, and I turned to look, and there she was. And you know what she was doing? She was encouraging the lady right behind her. Like, I'm thinking 20 years later, she's still doing the same thing. But this is who she is. She's just an encourager like Barnabas. Remind me of the story of Jackie Robinson. I'll put it up here. Jackie Robinson was the first African American to play Major League Baseball. You might have seen a story in the recent movie 42. At almost every stadium, he had to endure racial slurs and name-calling. The movie portrays a true scene from Jackie's first season. The Brooklyn Dodgers were playing in Cincinnati. A ground ball was hit to Jackie Robinson and he missed it for an error. The fans intensified their yelling and jeering. He hung his head in shame and later said he considered leaving the field and leaving baseball that day. But the shortstop for the Dodgers, Pee Wee Reese, came over from his position. He stood beside Jackie Robinson and then put his arm around Jackie's shoulder. Pee Wee Reese was one of the most respected ball players in the country. As he stood there with his arm around Jackie's shoulder, the fans grew quiet. Later, Jackie Robinson said that arm around his shoulder saved his career. I can't imagine what the Apostle Paul would have done if Barnabas had not been there to encourage him. Look at Hebrews 10:24. Oh, let us consider how we may spur one another towards love and good deeds. That's like our job as Christians, like encourage others. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Someone said this, encouragers are God's jumper cables for the church. I love that. When our car doesn't start, it's usually because we left a light on and the battery is dead. When we are discouraged, we need someone to pull their car beside us and put jumper cables from their car to ours. And just like it gives power to the dead battery, so does encouragement for those who feel dead and discouraged. It kind of just gets them going again, just like a jumper cable to a car. But this is what Barnabas did with Saul. He saw his past. He saw who he used to be. But he saw this future potential in his life. And he did that by just not buying into the gossip of everyone else, not buying into what everyone else thought, which made me think, how are we doing? Are we encouraging that recovering alcoholic or the drug addict or the stripper or the prostitute? Or can you see someone's potential instead of looking at their past? Because Barnabas, that's exactly what he did. The second way Barnabas was an encourager is that he gave people second chances. And we see this in Acts 15. He wasn't the kind of person that said, you know what, you blew it. You blew it. I don't trust you anymore. You hurt me. You failed me. I'm done with you. He never did that. Instead, Barnabas held out his hand and helped the person back up again. We see this when Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey. They took a man by the name of John Mark. He eventually wrote the Gospel of Mark. But John Mark was kind of training for the ministry. But partway through the trip, he left. He quit. He went back home. And Acts doesn't tell us why. It doesn't tell us why John Mark left. Maybe he was sick. Maybe something happened back at home. But Paul was angry. Paul looked at it like, he's just pathetic and he couldn't hack it. Like, this is Paul's thinking. But Barnabas and Paul are getting ready for a second missionary trip. And Barnabas wants to take John Mark, give him a second chance. And Paul was like, nope, not doing it. Absolutely not. And Barnabas was willing, like, no, we really need to take him with us. Look at Acts 15, verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with him. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, this was a big deal. This was a huge disagreement from the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, the encourager. But Luke never tells us who's right or who's wrong, because they both feel like they're doing what God is calling them to do. Barnabas is trying to encourage, Paul's trying to get the gospel out, so they both split and go their own directions. But God used both of them. That's what's amazing about this story, is that Paul and Silas left, and God used them in mighty ways to get the gospel out. Barnabas decided that encouraging John Mark was more important than going on the road with Paul. And by giving him a second chance, we know that eventually he wrote the Gospel of Mark. And so looking back, it's like we have no idea what encouragement can do for others. And Paul learned this at the end of his life. As Paul is getting ready to die, he will be beheaded by Nero in Rome. He writes his final letter in 2 Timothy. And he writes this at the very end. He said, get Mark, John Mark, and bring him with you. He's talking to Luke. Who is he talking to? He writes this, Timothy. And he's saying, get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. Paul was able to see at the end of his life the importance of people and encouraging them, because this is the guy, John Mark was the one that he didn't want anything to do with. And yet now he realizes that John Mark can be so encouraging to him. So, giving second chances is really important, and believing in people when nobody else does. So, here's how we'll end. If you feel discouraged, please go find an encourager. And if you are an encourager, find someone who is discouraged. Because I shudder to think of what would have happened to John Mark and his faith in Jesus if Barnabas hadn't been there. Or if Barnabas hadn't come along to encourage Saul when he first became a follower of Jesus. Florence Littauer has a wonderful little piece in her book called Silver Boxes, The Gift of Encouragement. She says this, do you know someone who has a song waiting to be sung, some art waiting to be hung, a piece waiting to be played, a scene waiting to be staged, a tale waiting to be told, a book waiting to be sold, a rhyme waiting to be read, a speech waiting to be said? If you do, don't let them die with the music still in them. This is a call for all of us to be Barnabases to those around us. Hope that helps you. Have a really good week.